Ever walk into a room full of people and still feel like you're standing on the outside? Not because you're shy, not because you dislike anyone, but because something just feels off. You hear the laughter, you see the conversations, you know how to join in. But instead, you stay quiet, not out of fear, but out of disinterest. It's not that you think you're better than anyone. It's that most interactions feel predictable, repetitive, surface level, and deep down, you crave something more real. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Because once you stop pretending, once you stop shrinking to fit in, you start realizing something uncomfortable. You were never meant to blend in. You notice patterns others ignore. You question things others accept. You think in layers, not headlines. So while everyone else is busy trying to belong, you're busy trying to understand. And that difference? That's what makes you feel disconnected. But what if that distance isn't a weakness? What if it's actually a sign of something rare? Because people who think differently don't always fit easily into systems built for sameness. And once you recognize these traits in yourself, you'll never see your outsider energy the same way again. Let's break down the 6 rare traits that quietly set you apart, even when no one else notices. So now that you know feeling disconnected isn't a flaw, let's talk about the first trait that quietly sets you apart. Because this one shows up in everyday moments, the kind most people don't even notice. Trait number 1. You think deeper than most conversations go. Picture this. You're in a group chat, a family gathering, or even just sitting with co-workers during a break. The conversation is moving fast. Jokes, opinions, headlines, trending topics. Everyone's talking, reacting, agreeing, disagreeing, and you're there, listening, observing, nodding. But inside, your mind is somewhere else. You're not just hearing what people say, you're noticing why they say it. The tone shifts, the patterns, the unspoken motivations behind the words. While others react to the surface, you're tracing the deeper thread. Someone makes a strong claim. Most people either agree or push back. You pause, not because you're unsure, but because your mind is already exploring the layers beneath it. Where did that belief come from? What shaped it? What's being left unsaid? Carl Jung once said, "Thinking is difficult. That's why most people judge." And you feel that. You don't rush to conclusions. You sit with questions. But here's the part no one talks about. Deep thinking doesn't always make you feel connected. Sometimes it makes you feel out of sync. When conversations stay light, fast, and predictable, you don't feel challenged. You feel constrained. You've probably been in moments like this. Everyone's laughing about the same recycled stories. The same opinions keep getting repeated. Nothing really moves forward. So you smile. You stay polite. But mentally, you check out. Not because you're bored with people, but because you're bored with patterns. You crave meaning, not noise. Even in one-on-one conversations, you notice it. Someone asks how your day was. You could say good and move on like everyone else. But your mind wants to talk about what the day meant, what it revealed, what it challenged. Yet most people aren't looking for that depth. They're looking for quick comfort. So you learn to hold your thoughts back. You don't want to make things heavy. You don't want to seem intense. So you simplify yourself. And over time, that creates distance. Jung believed the meeting of 2 personalities is like the contact of 2 chemical substances. If there is any reaction, Both are transformed. You don't just talk to exchange words. You talk to exchange perspectives. And when that transformation doesn't happen, something inside you feels incomplete. You walk away from conversations feeling like you were present, but not fully seen. That's the quiet disconnect. Not because you lack social skills, but because your mind naturally goes further than most conversations allow. And once you realize that, you stop blaming yourself for feeling different. Because the problem was never your depth. The problem was trying to fit that depth into shallow spaces. And once you realize your mind naturally goes deeper than most conversations, something else starts to make sense. You don't just think differently, you live differently. Because while others constantly look for company, noise, or distraction, you're surprisingly comfortable in your own space. Trait number 2. You're comfortable being alone, but not lonely. There are people who fear being alone, and then there are people like you. You don't rush to fill silence. You don't need constant messages, calls, or plans to feel grounded. You can sit in a quiet room with nothing but your thoughts and feel completely okay. Not empty, not disconnected, just present. Think about the last time plans got cancelled. For some people, that feels like rejection. For you, it feels like relief. Not because you dislike others, but because solitude gives you clarity. You use that time to think, reflect, process. You replay conversations in your head, not to overthink, but to understand. What was really said? What was really meant? Carl Jung once said, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself." And that hits close to home. Because you're rarely lonely when you're alone. You're lonely when you're surrounded by people who don't speak your language. You've probably experienced this. You're in a crowded space. Everyone's talking, laughing, sharing stories. Yet somehow, you feel more distant there than when you're by yourself. The noise doesn't comfort you. It drains you. Because your energy isn't built for constant stimulation. It's built for depth. And when depth is missing, connection feels incomplete. So you choose your moments carefully. You don't hang out just to hang out. You don't talk just to talk. When you show up, it's because you actually want to connect. And when you don't, you're perfectly fine staying in your own world. You've probably had people misunderstand this. They assume you're distant, uninterested, hard to reach, but the truth is simpler. You're selective with your energy. You know how rare your focus is, and you don't waste it on interactions that don't feed your mind. Jung believed the individual who does not follow the herd must be strong enough to stand alone. And standing alone doesn't feel like punishment to you. It feels like freedom. You think better. You feel clearer. You understand yourself more. Your best ideas don't come from noise. They come from stillness. And that's why solitude doesn't isolate you. It sharpens you. But here's the twist. The more comfortable you become with your own company, the less you feel pressured to fit into social patterns that don't suit you. You stop forcing connections. You stop chasing validation. You stop explaining yourself. And that's when people start to notice. Not because you're loud, but because you're grounded. You don't disappear. You choose where you belong. And once you realize being alone doesn't mean being lonely, you stop fearing distance. You start respecting it. And when you become comfortable standing on your own, something else quietly changes. You stop asking, "What are people doing?" and start asking, "Does this even make sense?" Because fitting in has never been your priority. Understanding has. Trait number 3. You question social norms instead of copying them. Most people move through life on autopilot. They follow trends, repeat opinions, adopt behaviors without really examining them, not because they're careless, but because it's easier to go with the flow than to challenge it. You don't move that way. When a rule feels unnecessary, you notice. When a tradition feels outdated, you question it. When everyone agrees too quickly, you pause, not to argue, not to rebel, but to understand. You've probably been in situations like this. Everyone around you has the same opinion about something, a decision, a belief, a way of doing things. The room feels settled. The conversation feels closed, but inside your mind is still open. You're not convinced, not because you want to be different, but because you haven't seen enough reason yet. Carl Jung once said, "The individual who does not follow the herd must be strong enough to stand alone." And standing alone isn't always comfortable. Sometimes it means staying quiet while others agree. Sometimes it means choosing a different path without explaining yourself. Sometimes it means letting people misunderstand your silence as distance. Think about moments when you chose not to follow the usual script. Maybe you didn't chase the same goals everyone else did. Maybe you didn't adopt the same lifestyle, habits, or priorities. Maybe you walked away from expectations that never felt like yours. Not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly. Because your choices are guided by meaning, not momentum. And that's what separates you. You don't ask, "Will this make me fit in?" You ask, "Will this make sense to me?" That inner filter shapes everything, even in small moments. Someone suggests doing something just because everyone does it. You don't immediately agree. You evaluate. Does this serve a purpose? Does this align with how I actually think? If the answer is no, you don't force it. You'd rather be honest with yourself than accepted by the group. Jung believed, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. You don't avoid uncomfortable questions. You face them, and that depth can make you feel out of place in spaces built for comfort over clarity. People who follow patterns often don't notice the patterns. People who question them can't unsee them. So you start moving differently. You don't echo opinions you don't believe. You don't participate in routines that feel empty. You don't chase approval for choices that don't feel authentic. And slowly, without trying to, you separate from the crowd. Not in distance, in direction. You're not against people. You're just for thinking. And when you stop copying the world around you, you finally start living in a way that feels like your own. And once you stop copying the world around you, something interesting happens. You don't just move differently, you see differently. Because when you're not distracted by fitting in, your mind starts noticing what others overlook. Trait number 4. You see patterns. Others miss. Most people experience life moment by moment. They react to what happens. They respond to what's said. They move on. You don't just react, you connect. You notice how certain conversations repeat, how the same behaviors lead to the same outcomes, how people often say one thing and act another way. And while others focus on the event, you focus on the pattern. You've probably had moments like this. A situation plays out, and everyone seems surprised by the outcome. But you're not. You saw it coming. Not because you're negative, but because you've already seen the setup before. You notice the warning signs in tone, choices, and consistency. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." You don't just observe people, you observe cycles. When someone repeats the same behavior, you don't get shocked anymore. You start predicting. You recognize emotional habits, communication styles, the quiet ways people reveal who they really are. And this doesn't come from judgment. It comes from attention. You listen beyond words. You notice what stays consistent over time. That's why you often feel like you're operating on a different level. While others debate opinions, you analyze behavior. While others focus on results, you focus on causes. Think about how you watch interactions. Someone can say something positive, but if their actions don't match, you feel the disconnect immediately. You don't need proof. You trust patterns more than promises, and because of that, you rarely get blindsided. You see the direction before the destination. Jung believed, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. You don't like being driven by surprise. You prefer awareness. So you stay observant. You notice how certain environments shape behavior, how group dynamics influence decisions, how repetition reveals intention. And the more you notice, the harder it becomes to ignore. Because once you see the pattern, you can't pretend it's random anymore. This changes how you move through life. You become more selective, more cautious with your energy, more intentional with your choices. Not because you're guarded, but because you're informed. You don't get caught in cycles you've already recognized. You step back. You assess. You choose differently. And sometimes that makes you feel out of place. Because when you see what others don't, you naturally respond in ways they don't expect. You're not distant. You're aware. You're not cold. You're conscious of patterns. And that awareness shapes everything. You don't just live life. You study it. And in a world built on reaction, being reflective will always set you apart. And when you start seeing patterns clearly, something else shifts inside you. You stop trying to impress. You stop trying to blend. You stop trying to perform. Because once you understand how people actually operate, you realize something important. Approval is optional. Trait number 5. You don't perform for approval. Most people adjust themselves to fit the room. They change their tone, their opinions, their behavior, not because they're dishonest, but because they want to belong. You don't move like that. You don't exaggerate stories for attention. You don't pretend to care about things that don't interest you. You don't reshape yourself to match the energy around you. If something doesn't feel natural, you let it be awkward. You've probably been in situations like this. A group is laughing about something you don't find meaningful. You could fake a reaction. You could join in. But you don't. Not out of arrogance, out of honesty. You'd rather stay quiet than pretend. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And becoming who you truly are means letting go of performance. You don't chase validation through volume. You don't seek attention through agreement. You don't shape your identity around external reactions. You stay grounded in what feels real to you. That doesn't always make social situations smooth. Sometimes people mistake your authenticity for distance. Sometimes your silence feels unfamiliar to them. Sometimes your calm feels like disinterest. But you're not withdrawn. You're just not playing a role. Think about how you respond when expectations are placed on you. Someone hints that you should act a certain way. Talk more. React faster. Fit the mood. You notice the pressure, but you don't absorb it. You don't force yourself into a version that isn't yours. Because deep down you know, if connection requires pretending, it isn't connection. You don't want a split version of yourself. You want coherence. So you stay aligned with your own rhythm. You speak when you have something meaningful to say. You engage when the moment feels genuine. You step back when it doesn't. Not to isolate yourself, but to protect your authenticity. This trait shows up in subtle ways. You don't oversell your personality. You don't chase approval through agreement. You don't mirror energy that doesn't match your own. You show up as you are, even when that makes you stand out. And over time, you notice something interesting. The fewer performances you give, the stronger your presence becomes. People may not always understand you, but they feel your consistency. You don't fluctuate with the room. You don't bend with the mood. You remain steady. And in a world full of masks, that kind of authenticity is rare. You're not trying to be liked. You're trying to be real. And once you stop performing for approval, you stop giving away your power. And when you stop performing for approval, something even deeper begins to develop. You don't just show up as yourself. You understand yourself. Because authenticity without awareness is just instinct. But you move with intention. Trait number 6. You're highly self-aware. Most people move through life reacting. They feel something. They respond. They move on. You pause. You notice why you feel what you feel. You question where it came from. You reflect on how it shapes your behavior. You don't just experience emotions. You analyze them. You've probably had moments like this. Something doesn't go the way you expected. Maybe a conversation feels off. Maybe a situation triggers a reaction. Instead of blaming the moment, you turn inward. Why did that bother me? What expectation did I have? What does this say about me? Carl Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." You don't avoid your inner reactions. You explore them. And that level of self-awareness changes how you move through the world. You catch yourself before patterns take over. You notice when you're pulling back, and you ask why. You notice when you feel distant, and you explore the cause. You don't just label feelings, you trace them. That's why your growth feels intentional, not accidental. Think about how you handle your own mistakes. Instead of defending them, you reflect on them. Instead of ignoring them, you examine them, not with harsh judgment, but with curiosity. You want to understand yourself, not punish yourself. And that curiosity creates clarity. You start recognizing your triggers, your habits, your emotional rhythms. So when situations arise, you're not caught off guard. You don't say, "I don't know why I reacted that way." You say, "That reaction came from something deeper." Jung believed, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. You don't want to be driven by impulse. You want to move with awareness. So you observe your own thoughts the same way you observe the world. You notice when your energy shifts, when your patience changes, when your focus drifts. And instead of resisting it, you learn from it. This trait often makes you feel different from others. While people around you brush off their reactions, you analyze yours. While others avoid uncomfortable self-reflection, you lean into it. Not because you enjoy overthinking, but because you value understanding. You don't just ask, "What happened?" You ask, "What did this reveal about me?" That depth can feel isolating. Because when you understand yourself deeply, you stop blaming the world for everything. You take responsibility for your reactions. You recognize your patterns. You grow quietly, and over time, your self-awareness becomes your anchor. You don't get lost in chaos. You don't get swept up in emotion. You don't move blindly. You move consciously. And in a world that runs on impulse, that kind of awareness is powerful. You don't just live your life. You understand it. If this resonated, hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who thinks a little deeper than the world expects. Because not everyone is meant to fit in. Some of us are meant to stand out.